Welcome to the Creative Play and Podcast Network. Join us as we share our favorite RPGs, one-shot games, tabletop games, reviews, and convention panels. Sit back and enjoy the show.
Hi, this is Kelly, aka Trixie from Ragnarok and Roll, assigned to Ragnarok Story, and Tilda Wimblewick from D&D Journey of the 5th Edition. First off, I would just like to say thank you to everyone for listening to our varied adventures, as well as for rating us on iTunes and rpgpodcast.com. If you haven't rated us yet, we would greatly appreciate it if you could. And if you're looking for more ways to support our efforts, we are now on Patreon, a great site where you can help us continue making more podcasts, as well as some special surprises for our patrons. If you can, please look us up at www.patreon.com/cppn. Every little bit helps. And again, thank you for listening.
Okay, I guess we'll just
start.
Do we rock, paper, scissors for who introduces the panel, or do you just want to go for it?
Usually it's the center person who gets the...
Okay, well here I am. I walked right into that one.
I did not take this.
Okay. All right, hi everybody.
It's actually the first person who asks who's the moderator.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Well, now I know this on Friday, so now I'm armed for the rest of the weekend. Welcome everybody to TusCon, the 50th TusCon, I believe. Yay! This panel is the expanding definition of fantasy. I guess I've walked into the moderator role because I'm sitting in the middle. My name is KJ Kabza. I've lived in Tucson for about 10 years. I write short fiction and have been doing so for about 10 or 20 years. My work has been published in FNSF, Tor.com, Strange Horizons, and most recently in Beneath Ceaseless Skies as of last month. I have several short fiction collections out. You can get the two most recent ones on the Amazon. And come to my signing tomorrow, 4 p.m. Many of what I have written is fantasy, and some of it has kind of slid all over the place, so I think that that's why I'm on the panel, the expanding definition of fantasy. And my lovely panelists are...
I'm Frankie Robertson, and I have started out with some publications in small press, and then I went to indie publishing, and I have 15 novels out and some shorter work as well. And it ranges all the way from romantic fantasy to, and this is published as Francesca Rose because it's got a higher level of eroticism in it than my other work. And this one is the new book that I have out this year, and it is a time travel romance. So, obviously I cover and I also have some other work that I didn't bring with me that is more of an urban fantasy. So I write all over the place, but it's all fantasy.
I'm Jim Doty. I write and publish fantasy and science fiction under my initials, J.L. Doty. I have 16 published novels, soon to be 20. I am a mix of self-published and traditionally published with Open Road Media and HarperCollins. And I have a new fantasy series coming out. The 4 books will be out next year. It's called The Dreadmark Covenants. And you can go to my website to learn a little bit about it. I'm releasing the first one on March 1st, and then each of the next 4 books will come out at 3-month intervals. And I don't write short fiction. I'm not good at short fiction. That's a very challenging type of fiction to write. You have to be good at getting in and doing it quickly, and I'm not good at that. and I'm much better at just going for 120,000 words.
Well, fortunately, that's not this panel, so I don't
Yeah.
about that.
I tried to write short fiction once, and it went well, and I after 40,000 words, I was done.
That's a third smaller than normal. You're getting there. Okay, so I think I would like to start by taking a closer look at this title, the expanding definition of fantasy. I think that the title presupposes that we have a definition of fantasy already in our minds.
Good point.
So I would like to ask the panelists, what is your this is just your knee-jerk reaction, your gut reaction. Like, if somebody asked you, what is fantasy, and you had no time to think, what would you blurt out?
I would blurt out that it is something that has fantastical elements, which is not, it's kind of cheating because but it's non-real in some element of the book. Doesn't mean all elements, but in some element of the story is not real, not something that can actually happen in real life.
So, political literature.
We're already there. We're only 2 minutes into the panel.
All right, push the limits.
I was on a panel a few years back, and I can't remember the name of it, but it was right after he was elected, and I think the gist of the panel was, what the fuck have we done now?
And no, you're not going to wake up. Not in 4 years.
That's right.
Maybe not even then.
Can we gently steer this
Yes.
back to the
Yes.
fantasy?
So 30 years ago, I would have said, take J.R.R. Tolkien and then do what everyone else has done and just rewrite that, but change the names, dates, and places to protect the innocent. And I think it has I wouldn't say anything close to that now. It's wide open, which I think is cool.
Yes.
Do you have anything more concrete than wide open? Rather than, or would you just like echo what Frankie said?
Everything from Jim Butcher to Laura K. Hamilton. We've diverged Tad Williams. He writes. I'm trying to remember the name of the series. It was about 15 years ago. These people were in total isolation chambers, and they got stuck inside the computer. It was kind of like Tron-ish, but it was a lot better than Tron. So it just, I think we can go on and on and on with different types of fantasy at this point. I think it was pretty restrictive 30 years ago.
So 2 points that I find very interesting. I guess I'm the one stereotypical sad sack on the panel, because if you shoved a microphone in my face and said, "Quick, what is fantasy?" I would blurt, Anne McCaffrey, dreamy pastel covers dragons, some maiden with a lyre. Fantasy, yeah, let's go. But that's not
science fantasy.
Yes.
And Ray Norton's science kind of.
Yeah, probably. Like if I just blur, but so that's like where I'm coming from. So when I read the expanding definition of fantasy, what I assume is like, okay, challenge my own presuppositions of what fantasy is. If you really think about it, what is fantasy? But it sounds like my co-panelists are much more smarter and nuanced than that, and they're like already there.
No, we're just lying.
That makes me feel a little better. Thank you. But I want to pick up on something that you said about over the 30 years it has rapidly evolved. So when we look at this, the expanding definition of fantasy, are we talking about what time scale? The last 30 years, the last year, the last 5 years? Do we get to decide because we're the panelists?
Yes.
Okay. So where would you like to hem our discussion in on?
I am not well read when you're talking about the early in the last century, but I think that we could go back 100 years. I think there are probably when was the Worm Ouroboros written? I mean, that could have was 1700s. I don't know.
That was the late 1800s.
Okay, so but then I go all the way back, because I'm old, to reading C.S. Lewis, and that in children's literature, not literature sounds so highfalutin, but many children's books are fantasy, and so we have talking animals, we have magic. We have, and then what was it? The Gormenghast trilogy is technically fantasy, isn't it? Does it have magic in it, or is it just a bunch of politics?
No, not really.
No. Okay, so it's just
that was political. That's back to political satire.
political satire, and of course, was it Lord of the Rings, which was, again, in the sense, it was oblique political satire because they were satirizing a very popular book. But yeah, there's a whole lot of stuff that went way back, but it was all, I think you further back you go, it's like sometimes it's political satire, sometimes it's talking animals, sometimes it's sword and sorcery, and that's what I grew up with. And then you get to some of the bleaker stuff that I couldn't. I wanted to read Kushiel's Dart back in the, what was it, the 90s, the early 2000s, but people told me that it was so dark.
I found it more silly.
Hmm?
I said I found it more silly.
Did you?
than bleak. Well,
I found
we're
it-
getting down in
I found
weeds.
it dark though. I did find it dark.
Huh. Okay.
Yeah. And then we just kept on going with, and then there's all the, like, you brought up the Anita Blake stuff with Laurel Hamilton, highly sexualized fantasy, and
It wasn't. I really enjoyed that series, and the thing that I liked about it was that Anita Blake, she was a necromancer. She had some superpowers, but she didn't have superhuman strength. She wasn't Superwoman, but she always got out of these horrific physical situations with smarts. And I love that about that character.
yes, she was a very powerful woman.
And her power came from just being able to think quickly, but she didn't have the superhuman strength to beat everyone up, but she always won that way. And I really enjoyed that series, but
Although as you progress in the series, her
Yeah.
power came from her sexual experiences.
and that's where I stopped enjoying it. I mean, it was about I read up to about the 13th novel.
No, I quit before then.
And I finally, when she spent half a page describing the size of a man's dick, I was just, okay, I'm done. You know, at that point,
The expanding definition.
it wasn't expanding at that moment.
Disappointing.
I don't think we want to go down this road. I didn't mean to take it there, but I
I think we're all adults now.
yeah, but so someone who knows more about her Laurel Hamilton's life than I do told me that at that time she had gotten a divorce from her husband and entered into a kind of an open three-way relationship, and she was kind of writing about the kind of stuff that was going on in her life, but it took the magic out of the story for me.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you both went on this like digression about like sexuality and fantasy. Since we're talking about the historical trajectory the past like 100 years, like wide scope, would you care to comment more about general trends you've seen as far as like eroticism and romance entering fantasy, and maybe how that has expanded the genre?
I think it clearly has. There's, in fact, I used to belong to the Romance Writers of America, and we had Jeffy Kennedy come and speak to us, who writes romantic fantasy. And she made the observation that right around 2009, you started to see romantic fantasy became a more recognized and acceptable subgenre of fantasy, and because it was selling. And that's the bottom line for bigger publishers or even small publishers. It's got to sell. And so that's it. I got on the wagon sooner than that, but I didn't have a name for it. When I first started writing the first book in this series, I was just trying to figure out if I could write a novel. And then I thought, well, do I want to write fantasy or romance? And then I heard Diana Gabaldon say, well, my agent said that because she was deciding whether or not Outlander should be marketed as a fantasy or because it's time travel, or as romance. And she wasn't a big fan of romance, but her agent pointed out that the market for romance is about 5 times as large as it is for fantasy and science fiction. So she said, okay, and we'll go with romance. But with the incredible success she's enjoyed, you'll notice that her covers over time have evolved to look less romance and look more fantasy, or just look more plain literature.
Or historical.
Yes, more historical.
And she's shelved in literature now, not in fantasy.
Bookstore employee. She knows. What would you say? I mean, just if you don't mind me hijacking.
That's fine.
What would you say about the evolving changes in fantasy? 'Cause I know you're widely read.
I would say where it has really, really expanded is into young adult and romance. And with the romance, it more trends toward urban fantasy, where it's shifters and, people who can do magic and that kind of thing. And in young adult, it is high fantasy, but it's super dark. There's always a very bad, broken, toxic romance in the midst of it, and I sell a ton of it. The Fourth Wing series, no, I have not read it yet, but the second book came out Tuesday, and my store sold 100 copies by the end of the day Tuesday, and Barnes & Noble wide, on Tuesday alone, we sold 100,000 copies. So, yeah, it's bonkers.
Clearly, I'm writing in the wrong genre.
I'm sorry, what did you say was selling well in adult right now? You said
Urban smut, basically.
Gotcha.
They tend to be highly sexualized. Werewolf shifters, Disney villains is a huge thing right now. Taking things like Lovecraft or Wizard of Oz, or those that are no longer protected under copyright, and making them sexy. That's a huge thing too.
When you say sexy,
The curtains are definitely open.
yeah, so it's, I did not understand that there was a difference between sweet and sexy romance until a few years ago. I'm a member of a group on Facebook called Club Indie, and about 90, it's got like 20,000 members, and like 90% of the members are romance writers, and about 10% are science fiction and fantasy. And I got involved with it because I met a young woman who wrote romance, and she started telling me about the difference between sweet and sexy, and I'm, okay, so I got that, Kindle featured deal and thought, okay, I'm going to try a couple of these sexy romances to see what she's talking about. And this was, and now this is not a term that I came up with, but I read an article about this one woman who was a very successful New York Times bestselling romance writer, and she called it mommy porn. And their biggest market is apparently middle-aged married women. Do I have that right?
Pretty much, yeah. Traditionally, sweet romances are explicitly Christian romances. If you use the term sweet, it's almost always going to refer to Christianity. I don't know if that's still true.
They don't,
but
the
that's
writer,
what we kind of talk about it at work.
the romance writers in this group, many of them are former Harlequin writers, and they've gotten their backlist back. So a typical romance novel is 50 to 60,000 words. A typical science fiction and fantasy novel is 100 to 120,000 words. And they've gotten their backlist back from Harlequin and all these big publishers. And some of these women and men have 40 or 50 things. They've gotten it back and self-published it, and they're making, the poor ones are, making six figures. Right? But they distinguish very specifically, between cozies. Christian is considered Christian romance, not sweet romance. Sweet romance is meant, You know, what they seem to imply, and I'm an outsider, so I have this impression just from the conversations in the group, but what they seem to think of as sweet romance is the old style romance before about 2005 or so, where it's about the relationship and you move right up to the point where the sex is about to start to happen, and then the bedroom door closes, and that's the end of the scene.
Oh yeah, we refer to those as traditional romance. So
Okay.
sweet romance is Christian, traditional romance is that kind of thing where the curtains close, and then erotic romance. So they're not called that way. There's no like signs on the shelves that tell you that, but it's where they're shelved.
I didn't mean to take this as romance to say that.
No.
Because I don't know what I'm talking about.
No, I think that's just
Actually, you said everything I think is correct. I mean, I am into romance, obviously, and so I think you had it correct in everything you were saying.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I think this is all very useful, right? Because we're talking about the expanding definition of fantasy, and if a huge part of that expansion has to do with romance-related fantasy or erotic fantasy or anything that dovetails with that teen drama toxic relationship fantasy, like any of that, then it sounds like it can't be, if you're a serious fantasy reader or writer, it's not a trend you can ignore. So that being said, if you are a self-described fantasy writer in some way, what are you to do? Do you lean into this harder? Do you experiment with this? Do you go your own way?
I think you definitely, in my opinion, this is my own little bubble of the world, you have to put romance in your book. You have to put a relationship that has potential in your book. Not necessarily full-blown romance, but I think back to the work that had influence on me. And Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders of Pern, where you had Fleur and Lessa, and you knew that they were moving closer and closer together. There was never any sex. I don't know if they even kissed. I can't remember now. But and then the subsequent book was Fëanor and Breck, and I can't even remember their names. And that was also had an underpinning of romance. There's a whole world being built around them, but they had a relationship. And I think you see, if you look at most movies, whether you're talking about mystery or science fiction or fantasy or whatever, there are relationships. People care about each other, and that is really what makes people, how we work as human beings.
That's a really good point.
And I think you have just a little bit of, even if you don't get them together on the page, literally, or or not, you have that potential for a happily ever after. And I think that's another thing the romance writers have, right? Is that it's not a romance. It's not in the subgenre of romance if it doesn't have a happily ever after or happily for now. And most readers, and it's not all, but most readers want to have some expectation that something good is going to happen. Now, if you're writing a trilogy and the series arc is not going to be done until the third book or the fifth book or whatever, you don't necessarily, you have a lot more time to develop what's going on. You don't have to do it all at once. You don't have to rush things.
But I think, so I typically, most of my stories include both a hero and a heroine, and there's commonly a romance angle between them at some point. In terms of calling something a romance, one of the things that the romance writers that I know are really, if I say this wrong, they'll be all over me. The whole, like especially in sweet romance, the whole story has to be about the relationship. Whereas I tend to include, my story is about, it's a science fiction or fantasy, and if I did everything about the relationship, it wouldn't be a good science fiction or fantasy story. It's really more the relationship is part of what happens as part of the story, and it's an important part. As you said, relationships are really important, but the romance writers require it to be the story has to be about.
You're absolutely right. You are. That is absolutely correct. If you're talking about, if you're going to write a romance, the romance has to be front and center. But that's where we bring it back to fantasy, is that then there are these subgenres like fantasy romance, where there's a lot of other stuff going on in this book, for example. Yes, it's one of the driving things in the story, but it's not the only thing happening. And so, yeah, it's a romance, but it's something else as well. And whereas these two they're definitely romances with other things going on. But this is like some fantasy with a romance going on, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, yeah.
So I think since you brought up the point that you think every story needs to have some underpinning of a relationship in it because that's just how we are as humans, and you agreed that was a good point, I'm interested to hear some examples from you of fantasy that you have read either before or post 2009, when you said this really picked up, where a relationship, one or more, a romantic relationship is handled really, really well. Although it might not necessarily be marketed as romantic fantasy.
Patty Briggs.
Yeah.
Say that again, please.
The Mercy Thompson series by Patricia Briggs and the Alpha Omega series by Patricia Briggs they both have really, really strong romantic relationships, but the stories are driven by other things.
And it evolves. This is a series. It's got a big series arc in terms of instead of like you get your happily ever after at the end of each. You do get a happily ever after at the end of each volume, but it's not the romantic one necessarily. It took her like 4 books for her to get together with the hero.
Yeah, Alpha and Omega was Runaway, but
Yes,
Mercy Thompson,
but
it was 4 or 5 books.
Yeah.
But I think when writing science fiction or fantasy, when writing anything, you have especially if you have an established group of fans, you have a contract with your fans and with your readers. And even with new fans and readers, people have, this is science fiction and this is fantasy, and I'm going into the section of science fiction and I want to buy a science fiction book. And if you call it a science fiction book, but you put too much of the romantic angle in it, you're going to upset a lot of readers, and they're not going to be happy with that. I think so you really, if it's science or if it's epic fantasy, if it's coming of age epic fantasy or something like that, if that's the label you put on it, and I don't have a problem with those labels, because imagine a bookstore without labels. Well, everything's author listed alphabetically.
Right.
I want to go to the science fiction section, or the fantasy. But you, pardon me.
I said that's my nightmare.
Yeah, because people go, where's the science fiction section?
Well,
or where's the fantasy, or where's the romance section? But what I'm saying is if you're writing a science fiction book, you can include. I think it's good to include relationships. Starman Jones, Max Jones's relationship with Sam Anderson was an enormous thing in that book. It was not sexual, it was more mentor to, student relationship, but, Max grew because of that relationship. This is pure, hard science fiction, which means it's fantasy too, right? And so there's that relationship. But if you make it all about the relationship, people are not going. I think they're not going to be happy.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think in that regard, fantasy, if the fantasy is the primary genre, you have more latitude in what you can include and how much time you can spend on other things.
You and I have to find something to disagree about.
Yes.
I could fabricate an opinion I don't actually have. Usually generates that kind of argument.
But as a moderator, you should contribute just as much. Don't be afraid to chime in.
Well, I was waiting until you were done.
That's never going to happen.
Oh,
That's never going to happen.
All right, well then, shut up and let me make a point.
Okay.
Kindly shut up. So you said that it was interesting to me when you mentioned the contract with readers and saying, well, people are going to want something that's strictly science fiction, or they're going to be mad if it's not science fiction enough, and so on and so forth. When I think about like the expanding definition of fantasy and all these different little niches that we have, whether it's sweet romance by one name or another, or urban smut, or whatever, however you care to splinter it, I actually think that all of these terms are terribly useful because there are readers who only want that one precise thing, and they want to know where to get that. So we haven't talked about any cane thumpy moralizing. Is the expansion and definition of fantasy good or bad? But on the whole, I think it's good because it means more choices for readers and people can more easily find what they want. So I would, I too would agree with your point about like readers have certain expectations and you should be like mindful of fulfilling them. But I'd say anything goes as long as it's clearly labeled and people can find what they're looking for.
I was just going to say something to that effect. I think there's nothing wrong with writing something that's unusual, but you want to make sure that the reader understands that maybe it's a dark science fiction story. They should understand they're going to get dark science fiction, not Star Wars. Right?
Of course, to some extent, the back cover copy, the flap copies, should also give them some idea of what they're getting. I do remember, I absolutely agree. Sorry, with you about managing reader expectations, and in a way that kind of shaped my recent last book is that I was going to set out to write a Hallmark kind of romance, a Hallmark time travel thing, and I just couldn't keep the sex out of it.
But the point I was trying to make,
reader expectations though.
But the point I was trying to make was if you put a blurb on the cover that says this is kind of a Hallmark sexy romance science fiction story, then the reader's going to think, some people are going to go, that's going to be, they might not buy it, but some are going to say, well, that's going to be kind of unusual, and they're not going to pick it up thinking I'm going to read a science fiction book, and then go, God damn it, this is not.
One of the things too is, I don't know if you guys touched on mystery at all, because kind of what would be considered urban fantasy, or in some cases now they're going with like straight up fantasy, but it has a very, very strong mystery. There's a wonderful hard science fiction book out there. If you have not read the Murderbot Diaries, read the Murderbot Diaries.
Very fun.
And that is mystery. And it does have a relationship, but it's kind of in the creator versus robot. It's from the point of view of a robot. It's wonderful.
I'm glad you brought up mystery, because I had also wanted to ask the panelists, even though we've been largely talking about romance and eroticism and other things that have expanded the definition of fantasy, like what other trends would you say historically over the past 100 years, or more recently as of 2009-ish we were talking about, have contributed to that expansion? And if nobody up here said that they also wrote mystery, but are we going to talk about that, or...
I may have mystery elements in mind, but I don't think I really write mystery.
You made me think of Simon R. Green. He hasn't written anything in that. I'm trying to remember. It's a really great mashup of futuristic fiction, fantasy. He's kind of a detective, but his mother is Satan,
He's kind of a detective, but his mother is Satan.
His mother is Satan, and the story is frequently about him going out to solve a detective situation, solve a mystery, but at the same time he's got to deal with all these supernatural elements that are getting in his way, and usually trying to kill him, which makes it more fun. But you made me think of that because it's really a mashup of so many things. Has anyone read Simon Green? All right. Did I describe it right?
Yeah.
But it's really fun. It's a fun read, isn't
The
it?
Hellhound Detective Agency too. I don't know about. Was a set of stories about where the detective has a hellhound as his partner. Like, okay.
Ilona Andrews, in I don't remember the name of the series, but she has it's fantasy and romance and mystery, because the heroine, who starts out like the first 3 or 4 of the series before her sister takes over the primary position, is they have a family private detective agency in an environment where the elite families of the area have magic, and they have been controlling a lot of stuff. And this family the kids are showing up to have the level of magic that makes them qualify for inclusion in the elite, and the elite are not too happy about it. In the meantime, she's getting involved with this guy who's another member of the elite, and she's also researching. She's doing a job for a client who was asking her to investigate some other, supernatural kind of event. So that, I think, it includes all 3 of the elements we've been discussing.
I was thinking of Tanya Huff's series. I'm not going to remember the name, but they all have the word blood in the title. There's Blood Price, Blood Debt, Blood, something like that, around I think 2000, 2005.
I had like a show for a couple seasons. They got a couple seasons I think it was called Blood Ties.
Oh, yes. I think you're right. Yeah, so all that.
Is that Tanya Huff?
That's Tanya Huff, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And also,
Set in Toronto.
you keep raising your hand and we keep just talking. Did you have something to add? Sorry.
I was wondering if something that I thought of before I came. Wondering if you're going to touch on how science has changed the definitions of science fiction fantasy. Because when I was a kid, spending my allowance on science fiction fantasy magazine and Asimov, my family pretty much, it was all fantasy crap. And then we were all standing out in the backyard watching Sputnik go over.
Yeah.
And there was suddenly the differentiation, science fiction, fantasy.
Yep.
And, in the last 100 years, thinking of H.G. Wells, how much science has moved science fiction and fantasy borders.
That is an excellent question. I'm taking notes, so I'm not answering right now. But if you guys want to
I think it's an excellent point. It's not weird. Well, it's more science fiction. I remember thinking reading an article about how with Star Trek, the evolving level of their own technology made it more difficult for them when they were creating some of the subsequent spin-offs. I remember when Enterprise came out, and they were talking about, okay, we need to come up with a communicating situation, but we needed to be more primitive than it was in the original and classic Trek. But we needed to be more evolved than what we have now. And of course, we all have cell phones. That made it a little bit tricky for them. And that kind of thing is exactly, I think, is part of what you're talking about.
Yes.
The Star Trek. Oh, am I interrupting anyone?
I just wanted to comment on your question. I think one of the things where science has been playing an enormous role in influencing what we write is that with modern cosmology today, we're all starting to see more and more how science is not exact. Most people like to, so I'm a scientist, my specialty is laser physics, okay, and most people like to put science in this, 2 + 2 = 4. But if I take 100 mathematicians with PhDs in math and put them in a room and ask them what 2 + 2 is, I'm going to get 100 different answers, and not one of them is going to be 4. But cosmology, what we're all seeing, I think, what we're all seeing, and I think the way it's influencing the way we write, is that about every 10 years they go, oh, never mind. We had it wrong, dark matter. Oh, the universe is slowing down. We all knew that. It was slowing down as it expands, and suddenly they learn, no, it's not. And so now the only thing that can explain that is if there's a whole bunch of matter out there that we can't account for. It's like if I kind of sample and make a guesstimate of all the galaxies and everything in the universe, I can come up with this big number for the total mass of the universe. And that's about 1/10 of what it has to be for the universe to be doing this. And so they change, never mind, So Emily Litella, a lot of people are old enough, but that. And so people, I think, are seeing that hard science, really hard science is hard.
It's a bit squishy.
I personally believe it's just so darn complicated that we're never going to truly understand it, but we can always understand it a little bit more. And that's all. And so I'm perfectly happy with it constantly changing that way. But I think you see that influencing the writing in science fiction and fantasy more so than what was happening in the 50s and 60s, where everyone kind of perceived it as...
They thought they knew how it worked.
Yeah.
And you made me think of two things when you were talking. Is that one was, so as we change, as our understanding of the universe in reality evolves, one could say that science fiction becomes fantasy because if you find out that, what we thought we knew is not true. But then I thought, no, that's not true. It's because we still look at H.G. Wells as science fiction, as a time machine, for example, as opposed to calling it fantasy. It might be science fantasy, but it's really only because it's not true, because the world doesn't work that way. But it was still, and I think really the difference between science fiction and fantasy is the approach, is the expectation that we can figure this out. There's a way to understand the world, and even if we don't understand it by the end of the book, we have the sense that there is a methodology, and there's a scientific method, and we can figure things out. Whereas in fantasy, sometimes fantasy includes a certain amount, like schools of magic, where there are rules, there are ways of doing things. And in a sense, it's almost like a science fiction approach to fantasy. But it's also, there's a certain amount of hand-waving in a lot of fantasy, where we're not going to explain too much about how that wardrobe transported poor children into another universe. Or, take your pick. I certainly do a lot of hand-waving.
Trust me, hand-wavium is one of the most important scientific elements for good scientific papers.
Yes. I'm interested also in the elements of things that we popularly think of as science fiction, but have just been grandfathered into science fiction, even though they're clearly fantastical, but people haven't really moved them in that way, like time travel or FTL of your choice, and all that science should have said, oh yeah, this is clearly fantasy, but we're all just so used to seeing it in the science fiction section that we go, oh yeah, that's totally.
That's all you have to do is say faster like engines, and then you're there. And what was it? Oh my gosh, was it back in the 1930s or 40s? When the Lensman series came out by E. Doc Smith.
E. Doc Smith.
Yes. I loved those when I was a teenager, and a friend of mine said he he was trying to read it to his teenage sons, because they started when they were kids and they just kept on reading stuff. And he said, when he got to the Skylark series instead, he said, I just couldn't do it. I mean, it was so sexist. It was but he will still quote this line from the Lensman series of what our human Lensman says to his friend, because multiple races throughout the universe, some of them they earned their right to be Lensmen, which are these special elite people who, we won't go into details, but anyway, one of them is a snake-like insentient being, and our human says, "Attaboy, Wurzel, long may you wriggle." And he quotes that periodically.
I forgot what I was going to say. But I did see that you had your hand up.
Yes, so on the topic of time travel, I don't believe it's the time travel itself that would be science fiction. It's the mechanics behind it. If you're time traveling with like a spell or a ritual, then it's fantasy. But if it's like a machine, it's the mechanics behind the fantastical element, not the fantastical element itself that is science fiction versus fantasy.
That is a fair point. Nobody looks at Hermione's time turner and says, science fiction! So
Stephen Hawking, in the last years of his life, wrote a scientific paper in which it's serious. This is not science fantasy, in which he is trying to prove the existence of the multiverse. And unfortunately for him, when we have a space telescope that's has 10 times the resolution of the James Webb telescope, or maybe 100 times, if we can make certain measurements and they don't match what he predicted, we can prove him wrong. If they do match, it doesn't prove him right though. So it's kind of an article of faith,
That's science though, that you can disprove it.
Pardon me?
I said that's science though, that you can disprove it.
Yes, make it falsifiable, yeah.
So now, oh boy, let's not get into that. But if you make the measurements and they do match the cosmic microwave background signature that he predicted, that's what he said, then you don't prove him wrong, but you haven't proven him right, so you can't not predict it.
Right.
What?
we are actually nearing the end of our time, so maybe we should just put that on the
I have no idea what I just said.
We'll just scratch that. So that we have like 5 or 10 minutes at the end, so we can clear out and move to our next panels or whatever. I'd like to wrap things up nowish and ask our panelists if you have any thought on where the expanding definition of fantasy is going next.
No.
Dale Doty.
No, but give me the floor and I'll talk.
I
had one thought before we even came into this, and the kind of definition was with vampires and things coming on the scene. That implies that changed everything. But 40 years ago, Andre Norton was writing the Darkover series, which is a mishmash of space travel and magic and stuff like that.
Actually, Marion Zimmer Bradley did
Marion Zimmer Bradley, sorry. Marion Zimmer Bradley was writing this mishmash of space travel. Thank you for correcting me. We do have something we did. But, so there has been, going back 40 years, there's been all sorts of variations on fantasy and science. So I don't think it's a new thing. I think
mishmash has always been there at some point or other.
Yeah, I just don't think it's a new thing. So.
Well, that sounds very smart, so I'm going to half copy what you said. And I'm going to say that I don't know where the expanding definition of fantasy is going, but we'll have been there before, but when we get there, it will be new to us. And the panel!
No one recorded that, right?
You're an excellent moderator.
They'll hold you on what you said on science.
Thank you for listening to the Creative Play and Podcast Network. If you enjoyed our show, please check out D&D Journey of the 5th Edition and Ragnarok Enroll a Scion Hero to Ragnarok Story. Also, check out our Patreon page for more content and behind-the-scenes things, as well as joining us for a one-shot game or two.